I should have known something was wrong the moment my husband ironed his own shirt. In 23 years of marriage, Gerald Holt had never once touched the iron. That was my job, along with the cooking, the grocery runs, the dry cleaning pickups, the birthday cards sent to his business associates, and the quiet performance of being invisible whenever it suited him. But that Thursday morning, there he was, standing in the kitchen in his undershirt, pressing the collar of his dress shirt with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for quarterly earnings reports. "You're coming with me tonight," he said, without looking up. I set down my coffee mug. "Tonight?" "The reception at the Belmont. The new ownership group is being introduced. I need a wife present." He finally looked at me then, scanning me the way you'd scan a room before company arrived, checking for problems. "Wear the black dress, the conservative one." Not, "Would you like to come?" Not, "I'd love for you to be there." A directive, like a memo. That was Gerald. "My name is Carolyn Holt. I'm 54 years old and I've lived in Asheville, North Carolina, for most of my adult life. I taught middle school English for 11 years before Gerald decided it looked bad for his image, a VP's wife working a teacher's salary. So I stopped. I became the woman who kept the house, hosted the dinners, and smiled on cue at events like the one we were headed to that night. I wore the black dress. It was fine, not beautiful, fine, appropriate, the kind of dress that says I know my place and I'm not here to cause trouble. The Belmont Hotel ballroom was exactly what you'd expect from a city trying to prove itself. Chandeliers that cost more than most people's cars. Tables dressed in cream linen with centerpieces so tall you couldn't see the person sitting across from you. And that particular smell, old money mixed with new ambition, that I had come to associate with Gerald's professional world. "Stay near the bar," Gerald said as soon as we walked in. "Don't wander. I'll come find you when I need you." When I need you. Not, when I want to introduce you. Not, when I want to show off my wife. When I need you. I drifted toward the bar as instructed, accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server, and settled into the practiced art of being invisible. I had gotten very good at it over 2 decades. You learn to stand just outside the circle of conversation, present enough to satisfy appearances, absent enough not to require any real engagement. Across the room, I could see Gerald working his way through clusters of executives with that particular energy of a man who needed something badly and was pretending he didn't. His company, Holt Meridian Consulting, had been bleeding clients for 18 months. The new ownership group at Vance Holdings represented his best chance at a contract large enough to stabilize everything. He'd been talking about this night for weeks. I watched him laugh at things that probably weren't funny. I watched him lean in too close when he spoke, the way nervous people do. I recognized every gesture because I had watched this performance for 23 years. Then the room shifted. It's hard to explain the way energy changes when someone significant enters a space. Conversations don't stop exactly, but they quiet. Heads turn with a subtlety that isn't really subtle at all. You feel it before you see it. I turned toward the main entrance and stopped breathing. The man standing at the top of the ballroom steps was tall, silver-haired at the temples, wearing a dark suit with the quiet ease of someone who had stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. He moved through the crowd the way still water moves, without hurry, without effort, displacing everything gently around him. But it wasn't his confidence that stopped me cold. It was his face. Even after 32 years, even across a crowded ballroom in a city I hadn't expected to see him in, even with the gray at his temples and the lines that time draws on everyone eventually, I knew that face. Marcus Webb, the man I had loved completely and absolutely when I was 22 years old. The man I had left. The man I had never in 3 decades of marriage. Managed to stop thinking about entirely. That's him, a woman near me murmured to her companion. Marcus Webb. He built Vance Holdings from a regional property firm into an international operation. Worth somewhere north of $4 billion. They say. $4 billion. The boy who used to eat peanut butter sandwiches in the university library because he was working 2 jobs to cover tuition. I pressed myself back against the wall, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I was sure the woman next to me could hear it. This couldn't be real. Of all the business receptions in all the cities in all the country. But it was real, and across the room, I watched Gerald spot Marcus Webb and immediately begin moving toward him with that particular hunger I recognized all too well. Marcus accepted Gerald's handshake. He nodded politely, and then his eyes, dark and still searching the way they always had, began moving across the room the way eyes do when they're looking for something without knowing quite what. And they found me. The world contracted to a single point. For 3 full seconds, Marcus Webb stood absolutely still in the middle of that crowded ballroom. His hand still loosely held by my husband's, and stared at me like a man who had just seen something he had stopped allowing himself to believe existed. Then he was walking. Not drifting, not making his way politely through the crowd. Walking directly, purposefully, in a straight line across that ballroom. Straight past Gerald Holt's outstretched business card. Straight through every conversation that tried to intercept him. Straight to me. Gerald sputtered something behind him. I saw it in my peripheral vision. My husband's face cycling through confusion. Then irritation. Then a dawning, horrified comprehension as he watched the most important man in the room ignore him completely. Marcus stopped 2 feet in front of me. He was close enough now that I could see the details time had added to his face. The lines around his eyes. The gray woven through his dark hair. The slight weathering of someone who had lived fully rather than carefully. He was not the 23-year-old I had loved. He was something richer and more solid. Carolyn, he said, just my name, nothing else needed. And I was 22 years old again, standing in the parking lot of Asheville Community College in the rain. Watching him watch me walk away. Not knowing that I was walking away because I had made myself believe it was the only option I had. Marcus, I managed. He reached out and took both my hands in his. The same gesture I remembered. Warm and certain. His eyes were bright in a way that I recognized even 32 years later. Even after everything. I have been looking for you, he said quietly, his voice low enough that only I could hear it. For a very long time. I never stopped. Behind him, I heard the sound of Gerald's champagne flute meet the marble floor. Let me tell you how Marcus Webb and I came to stand in that ballroom 32 years after the last time I saw him. We met during our freshman year at Asheville Community College. I was there on an academic scholarship, intending to transfer to a 4-year university after 2 years if I could keep my grades high enough and save enough money from my waitressing job. Marcus was working toward a business degree while holding down 2 jobs, early morning deliveries for a bakery and weekend shifts at a hardware store. We were both broke, we were both stubborn, and we were assigned to the same section of Introduction to Economics by a scheduling department that, looking back, might have been operating as the universe's instrument. Our first real conversation happened during a study session in the college library. 3 weeks into the semester, I was attempting to understand supply and demand curves and failing badly. Marcus sat down across from me uninvited, looked at my highlighted textbook, and said, without preamble, "You're overcomplicating it. Everything in economics comes down to one question. What does the person actually want?" I looked up at this boy with his worn jacket and his serious eyes and said, "Are we still talking about economics?" He smiled. It changed his whole face. We might be. We spent 4 hours in that library. He explained demand curves. I helped him outline an English composition assignment he was dreading. By the time the library closed, we had shared an order of cafeteria fries and established the foundation of something that would define the next 2 years of my life. What we had was the kind of love that builds slowly and completely. The kind that becomes the architecture of who you are. Marcus didn't come from money any more than I did. His mother worked the front desk of a motel off I-40. His father had left when Marcus was 7 and hadn't been particularly relevant since. He was building himself from raw materials and force of will, and I found that more attractive than anything I had ever encountered. We studied together every weekday. We walked the mountain trails on Saturdays when we both had the morning free. We talked about everything, our families, our fears, the futures we were constructing out of hope and hard work. By the end of our first year, we had moved into the quiet, certain intimacy of people who had decided on each other. He proposed the summer before our second year, not with a ring. We couldn't afford rings, but with a handwritten note left in my textbook that read, simply, "Marry me after we graduate. Say yes if you agree. Say nothing if you need more time." I wrote yes across the bottom in red pen and left it on his windshield. We didn't tell many people. We were 21 and 22, working multiple jobs each, and the plan felt delicate, like something you didn't want to expose to too much scrutiny before it had grown strong enough to withstand attention. We were going to finish school, save money, and build something real together. And then my mother got sick. Stage 3 breast cancer, diagnosed in October of our second year. My mother was 51 years old and completely alone. My father had passed when I was 16. And she had no siblings. No real support network. The treatment plan was aggressive and expensive and she was terrified. And I was her only child. I left school at the end of that semester. Not because I wanted to. Because the arithmetic was unavoidable. My mother's insurance covered 60% of treatment costs and the remaining 40% needed someone to manage it. Navigate it, fight for it. She needed me physically present. She needed me full-time. Marcus wanted to come with me. That was the hardest part. He sat across from me at the small kitchen table in my apartment and told me he would defer his enrollment. Take a leave of absence. Find work in my hometown while my mother went through treatment. He said it like it was simple. Like love made math irrelevant. And I told him no. I told him no because I did the only math that made sense to me in that moment. Marcus was 1 semester away from completing his associate degree with grades strong enough to earn him a full scholarship to a 4-year business program. He had an offer already, conditional on graduation, from a firm in Charlotte that was exactly the kind of foothold he needed. If he came with me, he would lose all of it. And my mother's cancer might not respond to treatment, might not get better, might take years. I couldn't ask him to risk his entire future on an outcome neither of us could control. So I broke up with him instead. I told him our timing was wrong. I told him we wanted different things. I gave him the same careful, reasonable, thoroughly dishonest explanation that people give when they're trying to protect someone from the truth by sheltering them inside a lie. He didn't believe me, not for 1 second, but I was convincing enough in my certainty that he couldn't argue past it. I drove home to Winston-Salem. My mother went through 8 months of chemotherapy and 2 surgeries. She recovered, thank God. She recovered, and returned to health slowly over the following 2 years. I stayed. I worked administrative jobs, paid down the medical bills, and learned to live in the space between relief and grief. Grateful my mother had survived and quietly hollow from everything I had sacrificed to make sure of it. Gerald Holt came into my life during that second year of recovery. He was a friend of a colleague. Steady and employed and utterly uncomplicated in a way that felt like rest after everything I had been through. He wasn't Marcus. He never pretended to be. But I was 24 and exhausted, and I mistook stability for compatibility. We married 18 months later. I told myself I was moving forward. I told myself Marcus had surely moved on, had taken that scholarship and built the future he deserved. I told myself that loving someone doesn't obligate them to wait for you, and that building a decent life with a decent man was a reasonable outcome for a person who had made the choices I had made. I was wrong about all of it, but I wouldn't know that for 32 years. Back in the ballroom, Gerald had recovered enough from his shock to wedge himself between Marcus and me. His face tight with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Marcus, I see you've met my wife. Carolyn and I have been married 23 years. She's very supportive of my work." He said it the way you'd describe a reliable appliance. Functional, satisfactory, mine. Marcus looked at Gerald with an expression I couldn't quite read. Polite, certainly, but underneath the professionalism there was something else. An assessment, a recognition. "Gerald, we'll schedule time tomorrow to discuss the contract proposal." He turned back to me. "Carolyn, would you be willing to catch up for a few minutes? It's been a long time." Gerald laughed, that particular tight, performative laugh I had heard at 100 of his functions. "I'm not sure this is really the time for old college stories." "It's the time I have," Marcus said, simply. The 3 words landed with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades learning when to be gentle and when to be absolute. Gerald went very still. Marcus offered me his arm. And, for the first time in a very long time, I made a choice for myself. I took it. We found a quiet corner near the terrace doors. Away from the main crowd. Away from Gerald's furious gaze tracking us from across the room. Up close, in the warm light of the chandeliers. Marcus looked simultaneously exactly as I remembered and completely different. The boy had become a man. But the stillness in his eyes, the particular quality of attention he gave the people he was speaking to, that hadn't changed at all. "How long have you been in Asheville?" I asked, because it was easier than the real question. "I moved the regional office here 8 months ago," Marcus said. I told myself it was a business decision. The property market in western North Carolina. The proximity to Charlotte and Atlanta. He paused. I was lying to myself. "Asheville is where you are. It's where you've been." I knew that. I stared at him. "You knew I was here?" "I've known where you were for about 15 years. He said carefully, not in a, "I wasn't watching you. Carolyn, I wasn't interfering. I just needed to know you were all right." He looked down briefly at his hands. "When you left school, I spent the better part of a year trying to understand what actually happened. You were the most honest person I had ever known. The explanation you gave me never fit. So you looked for answers." "Eventually. It took me a long time to even admit to myself that I couldn't move on without understanding." He exhaled slowly. "I found out about your mother. About the diagnosis, the treatment, the bills. I found out about all of it about 10 years after you left. And I understood then what you had actually done." My throat tightened. "Marcus. You protected me," he said, his voice quiet but direct. "You made a decision about my future without giving me the chance to make it myself. I know why you did it. I understand the logic. But Carolyn." He looked at me with an expression that held 32 years of everything that had never been resolved. "I would have come with you. I would have chosen you over all of it. Every time. Without question." The words fell into me like stones into deep water, sending ripples through every settled thing. "I know that now," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you understand why I needed you to know that I know?" he asked. "It matters. Because the story you told yourself when you left, the one about it being for my own good, about making the right sacrifice, I need you to understand that it was also a choice to take that decision away from me. And the answer I would have given you was yes. Always yes. Across the room, I could see Gerald watching us with the fixed intensity of someone calculating damage. His face had taken on that particular careful blankness he wore when he was very angry and very controlled. I knew that expression. I had spent 23 years learning to read it and respond to it correctly. But tonight, for the first time, I found I had less interest in managing Gerald's feelings than I had ever had before. I married the wrong person, I said, and it wasn't an accusation. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a true thing that I had known in some quiet, sealed part of myself for more than 2 decades finally being said out loud. I married Gerald because I was tired and sad and I couldn't figure out how to want things properly anymore. And that was my fault, not his. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "What do you want now?" he asked. "I don't know yet, but I want to figure that out for myself. Not because Gerald decides. Not because I'm afraid." I looked at him steadily. "Can I have your number?" He produced a card, simple white with clean type. He wrote his personal cell on the back. "Whatever you decide," he said, folding my fingers around it. "Decide it for you. That's all I ever wanted for you. Even when I didn't know how to say it." The ride home with Gerald was the kind of silence that has weight. He didn't speak until we were through the front door. Then he turned to me in the entryway of the house he had chosen, furnished, and controlled for 23 years, and said, "You are not going to embarrass me with this." I took off my coat, hung it up. "I'm not trying to embarrass you, Gerald. Whatever that was, whatever history you have with that man, it ends tonight. He is a business contact. That's all he is." His voice was tight, precise, controlled. "I've worked too hard and come too far for you to undo it over some college nostalgia." I looked at my husband. This man I had spent 23 years accommodating, orbiting, shrinking myself to fit beside. I looked at him and felt something ancient and exhausted finally release its grip. "Gerald," I said, "I think we need to have a conversation that's been overdue for a long time." It took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of conversations that were really excavations. Uncomfortable and necessary. Uncovering the structure of a marriage that had been built on convenience and maintained by compliance rather than genuine partnership. Gerald was not a cruel man. He wasn't Fletcher from a darker story. He was simply a man who had wanted a wife in the way some people want a well-run household, efficiently and without drama. And I had been willing enough to perform that role for long enough that we had both forgotten I was performing. He fought the idea of separation at first. Then he processed it with the same methodical, analytical approach he brought to his business problems. By the 3rd week, he had consulted 2 attorneys and outlined a division of assets that was, given everything, more than fair. I think some part of Gerald had always known that what we had wasn't what he would have chosen if he'd known himself better at 29. He was relieved in a way neither of us had anticipated. Marcus and I had coffee twice during those 3 weeks. Just coffee. Conversations that moved slowly through 32 years of parallel living. Trading the stories of who we had each become in the time since we were broke and hopeful in a community college library. He had built his company through a decade of relentless work. Had married briefly in his 30s, a mutual recognition. He said that they had married because it seemed like the correct next step rather than because they deeply wanted each other, and had been on his own for 7 years. He told me he had almost contacted me a dozen times over the years. Had drafted messages and deleted them. Had convinced himself each time that I had moved forward. Had chosen the life I was living. And that interrupting it would be selfish. But then I was standing in that ballroom, he said during our second coffee, wrapping his hands around his mug the same way he used to wrap them around cafeteria cups. And there you were in that corner in that navy dress. And every argument I had ever made to myself about leaving you alone just evaporated. I was hiding. I said, with a small, rueful laugh. Gerald put me in the corner on purpose. I know, Marcus said, his voice quiet. I saw that. I saw the whole room. The way he positioned himself. The way he moved through it without you. I saw what your marriage looked like from the outside. He paused. I'm not here to rescue you, Carolyn. I want to be clear about that. You don't need rescuing. But I am here, if you want me to be. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. I moved into a small apartment near downtown Asheville with windows that looked out over the mountains. I took a part-time position at the city library helping develop their adult literacy program, something I had always wanted to do and had stopped allowing myself to want because Gerald didn't see the point of volunteer-adjacent work. Marcus and I moved slowly. Not because the feeling wasn't there, it had always been there. Preserved somewhere beneath everything else like something stored carefully against a future need. But because we were both old enough now to understand that love isn't something you rush. It's something you build. He called every evening. Sometimes we talked for an hour. Sometimes we just sat in comfortable silence on the phone. Each of us reading, existing in each other's company across the distance between his house and my apartment. It felt, those evenings, like breathing after a long time of holding my breath. On a Tuesday in late October, 14 months after the night of the Belmont reception, Marcus picked me up at my apartment and drove us up into the mountains to the same ridge where we had walked together 32 years ago. The trees were deep gold and red, the sky that particular blue that only happens in Carolina autumn, and the mountains rolled away in every direction like a promise. He didn't get down on one knee. We were both too old and too honest for the theater of grand gestures. He just stopped walking and turned to face me and said, I want to spend whatever time we have left doing this. Walking in the mountains. Talking about everything. Building something that belongs to both of us. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a simple ring, a small sapphire in a plain gold setting. Understated and beautiful. Marry me, Carolyn. For real, this time. Because we both choose to. I looked at this man who had carried our story for 32 years without letting it make him bitter. Who had built a life that was genuinely his while never quite letting go of the possibility of us. Who had walked across a ballroom toward me without hesitation because, as he told me later, there was never really any other direction he was interested in going. Yes, I said. The same answer I had written in red pen across a note left on his windshield when we were 22 and broke and certain that love was enough to build a life on. Some answers don't change. We married the following spring at a small ceremony in the Asheville Botanical Garden. 30 guests, mountain light, my mother, 78 years old and healthy, crying in the front row, Marcus's assistant, who had become a genuine friend, standing up beside him as his best woman, because Marcus had always been the kind of man who valued competence over convention. There was no dramatic late reveal at the wedding. No estranged relatives arriving to cause scenes. No villains unmasked. Just two people in their mid-50s standing in a garden in the mountains. Choosing each other in the clearest, most unambiguous way available to them after 32 years of choosing everything else first. Afterwards, at the small reception on the garden terrace, my mother found me standing alone for a moment looking out at the mountains. You look like yourself, she said, which was not something she had said to me in a long time. I finally am, I told her. She squeezed my hand. We stood together watching the mountains go purple in the late afternoon light. And I thought about all the ways a life can take you somewhere you didn't expect and how sometimes the path back to the right place is longer and stranger than any roadmap would suggest. Marcus found me a few minutes later, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. What are you thinking about? He asked. Time, I said, how much of it we spent and what it was worth and whether we'd do it differently. Marcus handed me my glass, then looked out at the mountains the same way I had been looking at them. I'd do all of it differently, he said, except the part where I ended up here. He looked at me with those quiet, certain eyes that I had recognized across a crowded ballroom after 32 years. This part one wouldn't change for anything. And honestly, neither would I. We don't always get second chances. Most of the time the windows close and stay closed and we learn to make peace with what was. But sometimes, not often. Not guaranteed. Not something you can engineer or earn. Sometimes the world gives you back what you gave away. A little older, a little wiser, with enough hard-won understanding on both sides to finally do it right. Some love is just patient enough to wait. I'm glad I was worth waiting for. I'm glad he was, too. Now I want to hear from you. What would you have done in Carolyn's place? 32 years ago? Would you have made the same choice? And if you ever had a second chance, did you take it? Tell me below, and drop the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has reached. Thank you for staying until the end. It means everything.